Good afternoon, and welcome to episode number 45 of At Your Service with Haber and Martinez. Today's episode is entitled Criminal Defense Litigation. It Takes a Village, and we have a special guest. You can see the handsome gentleman to my left. That's Dr. Ron Bergman, and underneath, of course, is my co-host, Ed Martinez.
Who's not so handsome.
Not compared to Bergman, anyhow. The purpose of today's show is to talk a little bit about some of the things that we do as criminal defense attorneys to work up a case and some of the interesting ways that we piece together our own practices with regards to specific clients, whether it's in relation to one or both of their individual and or litigation needs. Dr. Bergman is a source that I have used many times and will continue to use as long as he agrees to work with my clients. We'll get into the how and what of that.
Yeah, I have no plans to retire. Not anytime soon.
Excellent. Unlike myself, who can't wait to retire. So,
unlike myself, who feels sometimes like he's already retired.
So, what you guys need to know is, and the reason I took the idiom "it takes a village," it's not always simply a defense attorney who can represent you in a given case. Sometimes it is. Some cases are not complex. I don't want to call them simple, but they're not necessarily complex, and they don't lend themselves to the need to bring in an entire team. On the far end of the spectrum, there are very complex cases that do require an awful lot of assistance, and that requires a defense team to be put in place, or as we're using the idiom, a village, right? So, for example, we use private investigators routinely. Sometimes we have to use an accident reconstructionist or a toxicologist. Sometimes we'll use a polygraph examiner. There's all sorts of possibilities that we might use in terms of experts. But when it comes to mental health issues or mental health cases, there are two types of experts that we use. One is called a forensic expert, and the other is called a clinical expert. So just very briefly to give you the difference, a forensic expert in the area of psychology is a psychologist whose primary practice is focused upon court-related, litigation-related activities. Doesn't necessarily have to be in the criminal realm. Obviously, this comes into play in guardianship cases. It comes into play in family law cases. But in the criminal realm, it's relevant to use forensic psychologists for several reasons. One, the most obvious, competency to proceed. Second, when you have a potential insanity defense. And third, perhaps the most common use, is for what we call statutory mitigation. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But basically, the forensic psychologist is a liaison between the defense team and the court system. That's what that forensic psychologist does. He or she translates the language of psychology to the language of legalese in the courtroom. The other type of psychologist is Dr. Bergman's variety, although to his credit, Dr. Bergman did spend some time in the forensic arena, but primarily his practice is now clinical. And as a clinical psychologist, he is the archetypical image that you would imagine of the guy sitting in a chair with one leg crossed over the other, a pad in his hand, very patiently listening to the individual who's laying on the couch.
Don't tell me you're one of those guys that says, how does that make you feel?
Well,
all right, quickly, a therapist joke. People are always asking me, how do you listen to people all day long? And of course, the joke is, who listens?
Right. So that would be the clinical variety. He is what we call a therapist. He's a PhD. He's a psychologist. He's not some kid out of high school working at a suicide prevention hotline. Not to take anything away from those folks, but really what he does is clinical work, and he will address and talk much more about the concept of psychotherapy. But we use him in. And when I say use, we employ him as a member of our defense team for a variety of different reasons. Sometimes it's basic client control issues, like we will get approached by a client who we assess and say, you know what, he or she is going to be a problem for us, And so we need to put a buffer in between us and the client. We don't want them going to a bar and talking to a bartender. We don't want them venting their thoughts and feelings on the internet and creating potential electronic evidence. So we put them in a controlled environment with a professional who can really help them, and also help us to avoid, the dissonance that occurs between a very needy client or an overly needy client and a lawyer who really needs to be spending their time with a lawyer hat on. So again, we may use him for mitigation for other reasons. But that said, let me introduce Dr. Bergman again. He's been a practicing psychologist for damn near 50 years. Yeah, no, I hate to date you, Doc, but you got your PhD in 1973.
But I still look pretty good.
I didn't know you could start doing this at the age of 10.
Right?
Thank you.
So he got his PhD in 73. He's got an unbelievable amount of practical experience. As I said, he dabbled in the forensic field as a evaluator and an expert witness from, I believe, 77 to 94.
Yep.
But he has always done clinical therapy from 73 on. So with that, Doc, go ahead, take away and say hello to the audience. Maybe tell them a little about yourself.
Hi, audience. I think it would be important to kind of bring in the idea that a therapist who enters the forensic arena, the interface of law and therapy, or law and psychiatry, or law and psychiatry. When I first got involved in 1977, I was extremely naive. I was a clinician by training and experience, and I was sort of coaxed and encouraged and kind of talked into getting on the list in Dade County for court appointments. I was also utilized by the public defender's office. And although I knew what I was doing clinically, more or less by then, I'd been in practice a while. The forensic arena was new, intimidating, daunting, and I have to say that I learned sort of on the job and talking to colleagues and attorneys that I knew, and I became somewhat conversant with a couple of judges in the criminal court system who helped me along. But they're very different arenas, and it's important to make note of that.
What are some of the main differences that you noticed?
Well, the key difference is that I had to realize is that when I was up on the stand as an expert witness, I wasn't on trial. I was numero uno.
Right.
Because you get up there on the stand as an expert witness, all of a sudden the world changes. And I had it happen many, many times in the late 70s and early 80s until I got my footing in the forensic arena, when I figured out that A, I wasn't on trial, B, I was there to be helpful,
Right.
and C, the disposition of the cases was not up to me. I laid out things that I was asked to do as an expert. Initially, they were always looking to qualify me first as an expert because I was an unknown entity in the system. But once they knew me, it would be stipulated that I was an expert. And I was just there to give an expert opinion about whatever the issue was: sanity, competency, disposition, mitigation. And once I figured that out, it took me about somewhere between 0 and 5 years. Things went more smoothly after that. It's a very important difference, particularly for those who aren't specifically trained forensically, which I wasn't.
Right. So to put it in lawyer terms, when you get licensed as a PhD or a PsyD, and you get certified by the state, you get a document that says you can practice here.
Yep.
It's the same thing for lawyers. We get a JD, and we get a license from the state that says you can practice here. But very few people go out and just do whatever. We tend to find an area and I don't want to necessarily use the word specialized, because not everybody who just practices one type of law or one type of psychology is necessarily actually a specialist,
That's
which
right.
is a designated term. But let's just say that becomes your focus, right? So I think, a parallel for lawyers, so that people will understand what you're trying to express, is there's a big difference between a lawyer who, let's say, does transactional real estate or does closings for real estate all day long versus a criminal defense litigator. If you hire a guy who does real estate closing to handle your DUI case, you're probably going to find your way into a jail cell very quickly. Why? Not because that lawyer is not a good lawyer, just because that lawyer does not understand that particular area of law. So a clinician who sits and does psychotherapy is not necessarily equipped out of the gate to walk into a courtroom and serve as a forensic expert.
That's right. Generally, unless they have a background, from school, beginning at graduate school, in the forensic arena, they're not going to be experienced.
I think it's also safe to say, Doc, that when you first started your venture into forensic psychology, it was still a relatively new niche in the psychology arena.
Definitely.
We didn't really start developing forensic psychology until the 70s.
Well, there were not, as far as I knew back then, I mean, there were JD, PhD programs where you could become an attorney and a clinical psychologist as part of the same package, in a 6 or 7 year program. Probably the best one is or one of the best ones is at the University of Nebraska, for example. But now there are others dotted around the country. But there wasn't a specific arena of psychology then, and if it was in its infancy, of forensic psychology as a track in graduate school.
So it's kind of like, what happened was it exploded in the 70s, basically, and it became a targeted career goal for students.
That's right.
During the 80s and 90s. It's kind of like, to draw a bad permission to make a bad analogy, Ed?
Did you do it all the time? Why are you going to ask for permission?
Okay, I don't know, because Gutfeld always asks for permission, so I figured I might as well. I'm short and handsome, just like Greg.
Exactly. You guys can be friends.
Permission to make a bad analogy, and the bad analogy would be, before the first Jaws movie came out, there were marine biologists. They existed. But after the Jaws movie came out, Richard Dreyfuss's character was the, TNT explosion in the marine biology realm. It was an infinite number of larger number of programs had to be opened around the country.
And before Jaws came out, a hell of a lot more people used to go swimming in the ocean.
Yeah, I was one of
truly included.
Not anymore.
So
Not anymore.
let me give you all an example of a case where I brought Dr. Bergman in. To kind of give you an idea of how he was utilized. And this one was a kind of multifaceted approach. It was a very complex case. Well, let me take that back. It was not, the charges themselves were not complex. The dynamics surrounding the case were complex. And on top of that, there was collateral litigation. So in this particular case, my client was arrested for a act of domestic violence, a felony domestic violence act that occurred in front of a child. It involved a firearm. It involved alcohol and narcotics. And it morphed after the arrest into a domestic violence restraining order and a potential divorce case. So, and this was all very rapid. I mean, it was all happened at the snap of a finger. So by the time the client came to me, after arrest but before being charged, during this pre-file phase, I was able to get a very good global picture of what we were looking at. I also had met the client's family, and I was able to really assess what the situation was. And I decided that this was a very complicated client who needed a lot of hands-on attention and guidance, and he needed a support system around him. Fortunately, his family was absolutely, unquestionably going to be helpful, but it wasn't enough. I needed more. And you never know what's going to happen going into a case. I mean, she was looking at prison time. He had priors. He was known to the system. The alleged victim, his wife, had filed for a restraining order, which got him booted out of the house, and had him defending that. She was threatening divorce. So again, you had all of these things going. So I put together.
Boy, that sounds pretty complex to me.
Yeah, but the charge itself was not all that. It wasn't the nature of the charge that was complex.
No, it was the dynamics of
right.
Who the defendant was and the surrounding issues.
So and now, as an aside, before I go any further, here's a pro tip for you guys. These are the types of things you want your lawyer thinking about, right? You don't want your lawyer to have targeted vision only on defending the case, because a lot of times, oftentimes, there's much more to it than just the criminal case. And your lawyer should be able to observe it and know his or her own limitations, and then bring in the support staff, the village that it's going to take. So in this particular case, I brought in my private investigator. I brought in Dr. Bergman. I brought in a forensic psychologist as well, Dr. Richardson, because it was a Dade County case. And we enlisted the services of the family pastor as well as the family themselves. I based a treatment plan for the client around Dr. Bergman's recommendations. So the client started attending NA and AA meetings. He had sobriety check valves put in place. Dr. Bergman saw him for individual therapy. Ultimately, as the case started progressing, and it was several months down the road, maybe even closer to a year, we had now brought the pastor in and gotten a group session, let's call it, with the victim and my client, which we actually had to secure permission from 2 different judges to be able to do because of the restraining order and the no contact order. And then once that went, we did joint sessions with Dr. Bergman and the client and his wife. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, the goal was to try and get everything dropped. But when it comes to criminal charges, unlike that domestic restraining order, which the victim or petitioner in civil court owned and operated, the victim in criminal court doesn't get to control the flow of litigation. And as we know, or you should know here in Dade County, if you get charged with a DV, a domestic violence offense, the state attorney's office is going to come at you like a pit bull, that's prodded into a fight. So Dr. Bergman served a lot of very critical purposes in terms of client control, in terms of structuring a reunification plan for this family, in terms of being a conduit to my forensic psychologist to be able to proffer things to the state attorney and the court that I didn't want Dr. Bergman to have to proffer. Why? Because even though Dr. Bergman would have to have a waiver of privilege to speak to my forensic psychologist about our common client, we didn't want Dr. Bergman to get roped into being a testifying witness in a courtroom where the substance of the therapy might now become public information. So we were able to limit that by layering or buffering the stream of communication. So that's why Dr. Bergman and Dr. Richardson, my forensic psychologist and my clinical psychologist, have to work together to some degree, but also have to be independent.
I want to get Dr. Bergman in here on the question. Doc, when you're put in this situation like this, what Michael did brings you in, really is kind of like preemptive, because I'm sure at that point Michael hadn't even talked about a plea offer or whether he's going to go to trial or anything. We're just trying to get, God forbid, we need the mitigation. We're ready. We're going. Right. Do you take that into account in the treatment, or is your treatment the same regardless? Is it modified a little bit, modified a lot? How does that work for you?
Well, it would be naive not to recognize context. In the context in a situation like that is, we've got an individual charged with a couple of very serious crimes.
Right.
That isn't typical in the way that I get most of my patients.
Right.
So I have to be mindful of that. I just want to say one thing quickly, though, to blow a little smoke for you. I hope it doesn't get your head too swelled, Mike. But I've been
Believe me,
around.
his
I've been
head
around.
couldn't get any
I know
bigger.
it's
If it
already.
did,
I know
there
it's
wouldn't
like
be a hat
watermelon.
that would fit him.
I've been around a lot of criminal defense attorneys over the years, and you have to have a certain kind of humility as a defense attorney, which is not, you don't see a lot of in your colleagues, to be able to say, there's a lot of stuff here I don't know, and I could use some help, and to know when to bring in the mental health professionals.
You hit the nail on the head.
That's right. That's crucial, because I've not always seen that.
It's pervasive in our profession, and it goes beyond just mental health. I'm telling you, one of my pet peeves is when I hear lawyers talk about jury selection, and I'm like, you don't even mention, specialists. I studied with one of the foremost authorities and juries consultants in the country, Dr. Moran.
Yeah, it's an art and science
art form
to itself.
And lawyers tend to think, no disrespect to you, but mostly medical doctors, I think, are a lot like lawyers. They think that because they know the law in one area, they know the law everywhere, and they know everything. And doctors the same, because you're so intelligent, you think you know everything. But to quote Socrates, it's truly a wise man who recognizes he doesn't know anything at all. We're always learning. And using the tools we have around us is what makes you a better lawyer. Just like a good president or a good general. You need to employ your people around you, your colonels, your majors, your advisors, your cabinet. You're only as strong as the people you have around you.
But it takes a certain kind of humility to be able to do that.
Absolutely.
And be comfortable with it.
As a corollary to that, it's not only important to know who to bring in, but perhaps the most important thing, which Ed almost kind of touched on, is it's not enough to have them there. You have to actually listen to them. Okay.
Right.
I'm bringing in a clinical psychologist to help me with my client. And when that clinical psychologist says to me, Mike, you need to take this approach. You need to think about this. You have to listen. Because what the hell is the point of having you there if we're not listening to you?
And I'm going to paraphrase Theodore Roosevelt, who said, the hardest job of a CEO or president is not just picking the right people to do the job. The hardest part is letting them do it once you pick them.
Right.
And that's the key. And Michael understands that. I understand that too. We know that we have to listen to you. And then our job is to make sure that in the legal world, the things that we need to come out because of the elements of the charge come out from you, Doc. You got all the info. We just got to make sure that we're driving the car.
So what I do is I stick with what I know. And what I know is I know how to be a clinical psychologist and how to do psychotherapy. And I know about psychopathology. I know something about the interface of the criminal justice system, the law, and my particular profession. But I don't know it like I know, how to be a clinical psychologist. Right. So it was a learning curve for me to be involved with attorneys, to learn a little bit about the language of the law as it related to my role as an expert. But I always defer. Then I have to, recognize and be humble myself and not overstep and start telling the lawyer what they need to do or what they need to know. It's really in their realm rather than mine. So I'll say, this is something you got to think about from my point of view as a clinician, like with the case you're mentioning. The big thing in that particular matter was the guy didn't think he had any problems. He was in total denial.
That's exactly where I wanted to go. Right. I really want to run with this because, and we're going to talk in other contexts too. We'll stick with this particular case and talk about this particular client. But
yeah, of course.
I want to just kind of raise. I just want to raise
his case, Doc. He wants to stick with it because he's got to brag about it a little bit. But it's okay.
No. I'm not even talking about the outcome of the case. I'm just talking about the dynamic. But we're going to take a larger global picture when we start talking about other things, like when you do psychotherapy for lawyers or other professionals, pilots, doctors. We're going to talk about a program called Florida Lawyers Assistance. And that's specifically designed for Florida lawyers who have drug problems, alcohol
Yep.
problems, and mental health problems, whether they involve the law or not. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But either way, this is a Florida bar program. Sometimes it employs or allows for the employment of private contractors such as Dr. Bergman. But either way, the concept is the same. So when we're talking about this particular client of mine, his biggest problem was the fact that he didn't think he had any problems. Everything was just peachy keen according
And
to
it was
him.
all supposed to just disappear because he's really a good guy.
Right. And
Who,
she
made a little mistake.
She overreacted.
Yeah.
Everybody's taking it out of context. Blah blah blah.
Well, I'm going to tell you a
but-
similar story when you're done, but it's a little bit different. But the story I want to tell you also thought he had nothing wrong with him. But when I tell you what happened to him in kindergarten, you're probably going to tell me, how could he think that? But go ahead, Mike.
So this particular guy, I mean, he's a decent guy. But when you talk, some clients you talk to, they cannot wait to tell you how guilty they are. Okay? I mean, it's just a reality. And as a defense lawyer, the first thing I do is shut them down and say, please stop. Just stop now. I don't want you to tell me anything more. We'll get to that later. Then there's the opposite type of client, right? I never did anything wrong in my entire life, and it's conspiracy theory, and everybody's got it out.
It's all a
me.
big misunderstanding,
right? And then there's the people that kind of fall in between. So I don't know how a given case is going to resolve. I know what I'd like to accomplish, and in this particular case, I had a very clear-cut plan. But I don't know if I mentioned, I also brought in a divorce lawyer as part of the defense team as well, because we had to field this civil restraining order and a potential divorce case, which
This
involved...
is a perfect example of this idea of it takes a village.
Right.
And there were like 5 or 6 professionals of different stripes involved in this case. And you know what? The case needed every single one of them.
Absolutely. And I died, to my credit, I mean, I don't mind blowing sunshine up my own ass every now and then, especially when it's deserved.
You should, because nobody else is. So
because in this case, this was absolutely diagnosed by me, and this plan was put in place by me and effectuated. But this was one of those where when you sent out a group text to everybody in the team, there were like 8 people CC'd on the text, right? So, but it must have been extremely challenging dealing with this guy. See, I knew when I sat down with him that this was going to be that, he was going to be that guy. He was going to be that client that I could never get through to him if things were not going to work out the way that I wanted them to. And I can't predict it. So what I have to do going into a case like this, what any responsible criminal defense lawyer should be doing, is multitasking. Focus on our objective, whatever it is that we decide our target is. Like when you go to the gun range, point and shoot and intend to hit the spot that you're shooting, that you're aiming at, right? Try and achieve your goal, but never lose sight of the fact that there are other possible outcomes. And so if things did go south, I needed everything to be set up for what we call statutory mitigation, right? But knowing the type of guy I was dealing with, if things did go south, and again, I'm projecting out 6 months, a year, however long it took, if we get to that point, I need him conditioned to be able to deal with the reality of the situation. And I already know that's a problem. So that's first and foremost on my mind when I brought you into that case, was keeping this client on an even keel, keeping him out of trouble, but also opening his eyes to the reality of his situation, notwithstanding his insistent view of being targeted and misunderstood and, legally correct.
Which, by the way, was very consistent with his particular type of personality. There's a lot of narcissism, and people like that have an enormously difficult time taking responsibility for anything that's untoward in their lives.
Correct.
It's always circumstances, somebody else. It wasn't me. It was a mistake.
Wait. Is this my ex-wife?
Which one?
It's
Exactly. Which one?
generic.
Take a number like at the deli counter, Martinez.
Yeah. One of my mentors used to say, if the shoe fits, not you have to wear it, but try it on. Maybe it'll be
Just try it on.
Yeah.
Just see.
So that's a good example of the type of case. So how do you deal with that type of, I guess the term that you used when we were discussing the topics we were going to talk about today, to quote your exact language, was motivating individuals for psychotherapy and dealing with resistance to treatment.
Right. That's right. And often when somebody comes through a forensic avenue, it's because they've gotten into some kind of difficulty one way or another,
Right.
legally. So, these are people, generally speaking, who wonder, well, why do I need to talk to a psychologist? Or why are you referring me to a psychiatrist for medication? Just because, I'm bouncing off the walls. I'm good. This is how I usually am. So it's to be able to understand the person you're like always. I never know who's going to walk in the door, but we don't have to write a new textbook for everyone who walks in the door, because there are common themes that occur across all human beings, even human beings in trouble. There's a psychological test called the house tree person test. Draw a house, draw a tree, draw a person. And believe it or not, you can get an awful lot of information about someone's psyche if you're trained in doing that sort of thing. Well, there's another variation on that called draw a person in the rain. And what that's about is what's the person going to express when they're under some kind of duress. So, and when a given individual has a legal situation descend on them, that alone is going to impact the particulars of their personality. So you may not be seeing an individual who's that way all the time, but that's why it's important to have someone trained who can see what was this person like before they got into all this trouble.
Right.
So how do you motivate somebody who just doesn't want to be there? How do you get them to, look, I always say to people, I'm going to give you another old bad psychologist joke because it's apropos of where we're going here, right? How many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb?
One.
None. The light bulb has to want to change itself.
Well, that's right.
Right.
Only one, but the light bulb has to really, really want to change.
Right. So my point being, when I send somebody to therapy, again, there's the spectrum, right? I have some people who are like, oh my God, thank you so much. And by the way, at the end, I've never had a client complain to me about having been sent to therapy, especially with you. But in the beginning, sometimes you have some people who are motivated, but most oftentimes they fight. And so I will not accept representation of a client who refuses to follow my direction. I simply won't do it. And when I do get them to agree, then I actually write it in my contract as a continuing condition of representation. They must maintain, and I use the words meaningful and amenable. So my question to you, bringing it back to how many therapists does it take to change a light bulb? How do you deal with an individual who's not amenable? They're there because they're forced to be there, or they're compelled to be there, or they agreed under coercion to be there, but they don't really want to be there.
Yeah, the ones who are forced to be there, and we'll get back to the case, are those who are on parole or probation, who are mandated to be in some kind of treatment as a condition. They're going to come in typically very resentful because they don't feel there's any real good reason for them having to see someone who does what I do. In the case of the guy that we're talking about, although he was in denial, deep down, he knew he was in a lot of trouble. I think you had already convinced him of that. And there was a history there of volatility, explosiveness, impulsivity. And when I could point out to him after taking a history that what happened to him was the culmination of a journey that he's been on for a long time. And I said, let's look at the bigger picture. What do you have to lose by talking to me? I'm a decent guy. Let's make this enjoyable. And I started by not fighting the idea that he didn't need to be there. I said, if you didn't need to be here, your attorney wouldn't have. It's like when I say to an adolescent, if you have a problem coming to see me, don't take it up with me. Take it up with your parents. I'm not the one that's forcing you to be here. If
So,
you're here, we'll work
actually,
together, but I'm not forcing you to be here.
that reminds me of another aside, which I really want to make sure to get out because it's important. I want the folks to know, even though Dr. Bergman is here on our show talking to us about law stuff, and even though I'm giving you examples of cases where I've used him in my practice, he's not primarily a guy who just works for lawyers. He's a clinical psychologist who's in private practice. So he sees all sorts of people, correct, doctor? You see adults, you see
Every
teens,
day.
adolescents, children, marriage
I don't
counseling,
see
family.
I don't see small children anymore. I don't have the patience to get on the floor and play. But usually, starting about 10 or 11, I'll see people of all ages on up through senior citizens. Yeah.
So your practice is primarily personal or family or
Very eclectic. Yep. I'm
Okay,
a typical clinical psychologist. Yeah.
I just want to make sure the folks know that you do stuff above and beyond working with
Yeah,
lawyers.
I would say my work within the legal system is these days a relatively small part of my practice, but I like to keep my hand in it because I find it so fascinating, endlessly interesting.
Let me give another example real quick. I know, Ed, you want to tell us about it.
I just want to say something for the audience about whatever time you think is appropriate, Mike, for you want me to jump in about how even if they don't get a lawyer like you up front, it's not all is always lost. So whenever you want me to tell my little story,
all right, just give me 1 minute to say one more thing. Okay. So I referred another client to you, Doc, and I just want to bring this out because it's very common. And people should know that this is another way to deal with things. If you get arrested for DUI here in Florida and you have to face a DUI charge, if you want to drive, because DUI is what we call a bifurcated offense here in Florida, there's an administrative component that deals with the Department of Highway and Safety and Motor Vehicles that has absolutely nothing to do with your criminal DUI case. And then there's the criminal component that deals with court. As an administrative consequence, if you either refuse to blow or you blow over the legal limit, you lose your driver's license. And if you lose your driver's license, you either suffer the full suspension or you can apply for a hardship license, assuming that you don't challenge the suspension and beat it, which most oftentimes you don't. Anyhow, one of the requirements in order to get a business purposes license for a DUI suspension is that you have to undergo a evaluation by DMV's personnel or by some contracted organization for substance and alcohol abuse. And if they decide that you have a substance or alcohol abuse issue, then they get to subjectively, without review, decide how many hours of therapy you need to deal with your issue. And then they usually farm you off to their subcontractors to do the therapy. Well, you don't have to go that route. And so I have had a client not too long ago who had a DUI and also a felony drug possession charge. The DUI was purely based on alcohol pursuant to the charging document, yet drugs were also found. So there was a felony component and the misdemeanor DUI. Knowing in advance that I had a client with substance abuse issues and also who was likely in denial about that fact based on my interview with that person, I knew that therapy was going to be necessary. But more importantly, I knew that as a consequence of the DUI, and based on my reading of that police report, there was no doubt in my mind that this person was going to be evaluated and ordered to do 20, 30, 40, 50 hours of substance abuse. So I figured, let's kill two birds with one stone. Three birds, actually. One, client control. Two, prepare for potential mitigation, which again, Ed and I are going to talk about in a little bit. And three, also be able to have this individual do her or his substance abuse treatment with you as opposed to some, jackwagon that DMV wants them to use. And in that particular case, we were able to actually reduce the amount of hours.
Is jackwagon a clinical term, Doc? Is that
not one that I'm familiar with? But I'm originally from Philadelphia, so that may be the reason I don't know that term.
The bottom line with this was we were able to get this person's hours down. I think that they were assigned 30 or 40 hours down to like 12 or something with Dr. Bergman. So again, this was another avenue where you were able to be employed clinically, but be of assistance forensically.
Yeah, interestingly, Neither of those people, which is fairly typical, had any prior experience with psychologists, psychiatrists, with mental health professionals, although each could have used it because the one guy clearly had an explosive, disorder. And the person you're mentioning now, the patient client, had a history of substance misuse, and could have used some help. And neither one of them found their way to a mental health professional until they were arrested.
But the good news is that they did get the referrals, both of them. And specifically, the second person I was talking about with the DUI and the drug case really benefited in terms of being able to not have to go through 2, 3, 4 times the amount of treatment.
Yeah,
With somebody who
very
no doubt
practical. Yeah.
would have been far less successful in terms of dealing with that person than you were. So, and also there was the secondary goal, which we're going to get into after Ed I don't want to cut Ed off. I know he wants to tell something.
Okay.
But we're going to get into after that, the mitigation component, because in that particular case, we were able to use your psychotherapy in large part as the basis of a request for statutory mitigation and consideration by the state attorney's office, vis-a-vis bringing in a forensic psychologist to liaise between you and the state attorney. And so the combination of being able to do all of these things truly inured to this particular client's benefit, not only forensically and legally, but also personally. And hopefully that person will enjoy a much better life moving forward without the same issues that he or she had prior to this arrest.
Yeah, I try and let people know that that I work with who initially come through the criminal justice system, for example, that the door's always open, that we'll probably stop formal treatment at some point, but they should always feel like the avenue of psychotherapy is available to them should they have future difficulty, whether it's because of a legal problem or a personal life type problem. So it sort of introduces them to a world they would not have known otherwise. And I will often even say to them, because I believe it, although I was trained as a hard-nosed scientist, I've been doing this work for a long time, and I've seen things and experienced things that cannot be explained by science alone.
Right.
They just can't. In the case of this particular person with the DUI, really bought into the idea that she had struggles that she was not really aware of prior to the dominoes falling to get her popped for DUI. And I think it really is going to help her in the future beyond the disposition of this particular legal matter.
Listen,
Hey, go ahead and tell
on that note, I think I could jump in here, Michael.
Yeah, go ahead, because I want to get to mitigation.
Everything I'm going to touch on right now really touches upon almost a lot of things we've spoken about. Number one, the mitigation statute, right, which is 921, I think it's 921.0026.
921.0026,
Okay.
subsection 2.
The mitigation statute. Michael said, there's a bunch of subsections that you can use, but specifically
No, subsection 2 has like A through M underneath it. Those are all.
And as Michael touched on it, we like to use it and go to the prosecutor, but really it's not necessary because the judge has to make the actual finding. But it always actually,
unless the prosecutor stipulates.
It helps if your opponent in the case is saying, Judge, we agree with that. But you really got to be able to make a presentation to the court. And it ties into why this particular case will show you why you need to make sure you get the right attorney for the right case. This particular kid was represented by a lawyer who's a phenomenal, I'm not going to say his name, phenomenal traffic DUI lawyer. He's really good. He's been doing this since I started 20 years ago. But this was a major felony case that my client had been put on probation for. And while he was on probation on that major felony, he picked up a fleeing and eluding from the police, and a pretty bad one too, a helicopter chase and everything. So he revokes his bond, and now he's sitting there waiting for a violation of probation. He wants to go to trial on a hearing on the probation violation hearing with this guy. And this guy's like, okay, fine, let's do it. I don't really think you should, but I'll do it. And this lawyer didn't really know how to explain to him why this was a nightmare. The judge found him guilty on the probation violation hearing and sentenced him to 77 months in prison. Still, the fleeing and eluding is open. He's still got to, what are we going to do with that case? So the family contacts me. I spoke to him. I noticed he had some issues. The girlfriend told me that he had been diagnosed once as bipolar and maybe some other issues. So I said, well, maybe we got a mitigation here. Maybe I can convince the judge to convert, because he'd already done about 30 months in prison. Convert the remainder of the 77 months to something else, house arrest or something.
Did the fleeing and eluding get resolved during that 30-month period, or was it still open?
Oh, no, he was sitting in there. No, he got sentenced, and he's doing 30. He's already done 30.
No, I understand, but you said he was sentenced on the VOP, but the fleeing and eluding was open. Was it closed by the time that you got involved?
Nope. They got
so
me
the fleeing
involved.
And eluding was still open.
They brought me in for the fleeing and eluding. I'm the one who mentioned maybe we could do something with this because you said he's been diagnosed as bipolar. So
this is exactly what we're talking about in terms of a global outlook of how you can kill two birds with one stone.
So I said, Mom,
you're dealing with a substantive case.
Right. I said, Mom, do me a favor. Get me all the medical reports you can as far back as you can. She gives me all the medical reports. Doc, at 5 years of age, in kindergarten, he was diagnosed and prescribed psychotropic, am I pronouncing that right? Psychotropic medication.
Yep.
Yet when I'm talking to this kid, he's telling me, I don't have a problem.
Yeah.
I lose my temper sometimes, but everybody loses their temper. And I'm thinking,
especially when they forget to take their Haldol.
Yeah.
He was given
minimizing his problems. Yeah.
He really didn't think he had a problem. And now he's about 26 years old. And I'm thinking, okay, his underlying case was involved, obviously, aggression and drugs. Why? Because he's self-medicating. He's been self-medicating since about middle school. And of course, to get the drug money to buy his medication on the street, he starts dealing. Then he gets involved in that world. And now he's got to carry a gun. And the whole thing gets blown out of, just out of whack. So I didn't even need to bring in a doctor because she had so many medical records from kindergarten up until when he dropped out of high school. That's where he just fell off the map as far as his mental health issues, that I was able to present something to the court. And the judge was Judge Pooler, Teresa Pooler, who's wonderful.
Let me just jump in quickly.
Please.
What's important here is, and clearly this is not a caveat for both of you, but too many attorneys know nothing about mental health care delivery. Nothing. Whereas you guys are, pretty sophisticated when it comes to the whole mental health arena, so that either you can do things directly because you see things and know things about, basic psychopathology and so on. And you also know when it's appropriate to bring in somebody in the mental health racket, because you're aware of when there are issues with your clients.
Right.
I don't know why this stuff isn't taught in law school.
I'll tell you why, Doc. I'll tell you why. Because if I had a dime for every lawyer who told me things like, I can convince any juror to believe my story, I'd be a millionaire, which is a stupid comment.
Yeah.
And they just taught, listen, law school is an emotional beating. I don't know about medical school, but I can tell you that in my opinion, law school is an emotional beating. You're taught to take the beating and keep coming forward and keep telling everybody you're right. And I think a lot of lawyers graduate from law school and they don't even have a conscious understanding of what they've been taught, and they keep doing it in their daily life with their girlfriends, with their husbands,
I believe it.
with their wives, at the car wash, at the restaurant. They don't understand humility because you're taught you got to fight no matter how much you're beaten down. But I understand that my goal is to get the best outcome for my client, and that doesn't mean getting him free. When I started reading this kid's medical records, I realized regardless of what I do on this case, this kid is never going to be okay. He's never going to be able to be live a happy life in society if he doesn't get help. If he doesn't get
that's
help.
Right. Right. If a guy like that isn't made to understand that his life issues are a direct result of his mental illness, which is treatable.
Correct.
Then he'll continue to have serious problems.
And he just won't be happy. It's not about normal or not normal. We're all normal.
No, but he'll be in prison much of his life.
Right. So I presented this to Judge Pooler and Chambers with the prosecutor, who also, when I presented it to her, she says, you know what? Nobody presented this to us. Then we go into Chambers with Judge Pooler, and Judge Pooler is beside herself. She's like, why didn't anybody bring this to my attention? And I was like, well, Judge, I want to have a hearing, but, I want to maybe have a doctor review it. She said, nope, I'm looking at this enough. But not only did it not get converted, when we got to court, the criminal justice system, Doc, is not yet, believe it or not, set up. The clerk did not know how she could convert the remainder of his sentence to house arrest. She didn't know what to do. So the judge got frustrated and said, okay, then I'll tell you what I am going to do. I'm going to vacate my plea. She vacated the 77 months and said, and I'm now resentencing him to 2 years house arrest. How's that?
Yeah, that's a judge that's hip, with
1 in a million.
Has got courage.
Well, maybe not that much.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, we got
But she's the exception to the
that
rule.
building.
Yeah,
we've
she's
got
the exception to the
especially
rule.
here in Dade County. We've got a few judges that really do want to help, but it's up to the lawyer to bring this to the prosecutor and the judge's attention so that we can get.
You had to be aware. Wow, look at all this obvious mitigation,
Which the first lawyer missed.
Mentally ill.
Right,
So
the first lawyer missed it.
Right.
He's a good lawyer, but this doesn't come up that much in traffic tickets, and really, it doesn't come up that much in DUIs unless it's an addiction issue. This kid didn't have an addiction problem, but this kid had some very serious mental health issues.
Since we've only got a couple of minutes left, let me just jump to mitigation because, and again, this is not really what we would employ Dr. Bergman to communicate to the court. We would use Dr. Bergman's therapy as a jumping off point to arm our forensic psychologists.
That's right.
To then argue to the court.
It's the difference between being a treater and an evaluator. It's a conflict to be both.
Right. And by the way, there are many psychologists out there that, like many lawyers that really should not be doing what they do, do that very thing where they treat and testify. And that's it's bad form. It's a conflict. It's unethical.
Absolutely.
And it's irresponsible. So, but I just wanted to read the language to the folks real quick from 921-0026 to C, D, and G, because these are the three situations where forensic psychologists can help in terms of mitigation. And mitigation, again, is the mechanism by which a defense lawyer can seek to reduce somebody's exposure in criminal court.
Sometimes we can also get the case dismissed, but we'll do another show about that.
Right. So the first one is subsection C, 2C. The capacity of the defendant to appreciate the criminal nature of the conduct or to conform that conduct to the requirement of law was substantially impaired. Now, that can't be just because of drugs and alcohol, because voluntary intoxication is not a mitigator or a defense in the state of Florida as it is in some other states. But if you can show somebody's got cognitive impairment, right? They have a learning disorder. They have a substandard IQ. They have organic brain damage.
Are we talking about
any of a number of reasons? You might be able to leverage a capacity mitigator. D, the very next one, the defendant requires specialized treatment for a mental disorder which is unrelated to substance abuse or addiction for a physical disability, and the defendant is amenable to treatment. So this one is where you have a client who is diagnosable. What are we up to now? Like DSM 5 or 6 or 7?
6 or 7? No.
Where are we?
We're
5R?
DSM 5.
So
we're still on 5.
But they'll be coming out with more all the time.
So the DSM is the diagnostic manual that psychologists and psychiatrists use. It's what's accepted as a national standard for saying somebody's got a mental illness. It's got to fit somewhere into the book.
It's what I used on a regular basis before I got remarried, before dating someone.
So if
you give them a Rorschach, one or the other.
If you can prove that the individual has a bona fide legitimate mental disorder, it's significant. The kicker here is, and this is the one where you get screwed, and you really have to be creative as a defense attorney, and this is where your village makes all the difference in the world. It's the language that says, quote, requires specialized treatment. Because any prosecutor, even with rudimentary training, is going to argue to the judge, okay, so he's schizophrenic. Okay, so he's bipolar. Okay, so he's manic depressive. Okay, so he's OCD. But there are doctors at the prison system that can see him there. It doesn't require specialized treatment.
I got to tell you, the one leg we have up on the state attorney's offices in almost every county, at least here in Dade County that I've practiced in, they're not that up to speed on the mental health issues. They miss that sometimes.
Yeah, but if here in Dade County, there are a couple of sharp ASAs, but there's also a mental health division, as you know better than me. And those folks are really dialed in. So if you levy a heavy duty mental health defense, odds are they're going to wind up assigning one of those prosecutors who knows what the hell they're doing.
One of the things that helps a lot is what you talked about, going to see like someone like Dr. Bergman before you even get into that negotiation, because now you come to the table with, are they amenable? Of course, they've been seeing a doctor on their own already for a month.
That's a month. No, we do this for 6 months.
Well, I'm just saying, we do it for a month or
we
two.
Do a track record.
But that program, sorry, Mike, that program requires a diagnosis before they take it in, a qualifying diagnosis. So you can already come in with a doctor's diagnosis and say, well, here, we already got the qualifier. You got to send it to your doctor. Fine, but I already got one that qualified it.
And the other pro tip here is it's not enough usually to have Dr. Bergman, because he's very helpful and he gives us what we need. But then you need the forensic expert to hammer it home. Because you either want the prosecutor to take a look at your forensic expert and say, you know what? I don't want to do battle with this guy. I accept what he or she says because I'm not going to win if I go up against him.
Particularly when the forensic expert has credibility, credibility with the court.
We did a show, and I promoted it here earlier with Dr. Michael Brannon, who's one of the preeminent forensic experts in Broward. Why do I use Brannon? Apart from the fact that he's excellent at what he does, the state attorney's office hires him on every major crimes case. And he does training for the state attorney's office. So it's very difficult for them to look him in the face and say,
make sure that he tells you, because I'm a lot older than him, that I trained him.
I will definitely rub that in his face next time I talk to him. Here in Dade County, I tend to use Dr. Ralph Richardson, same type of situation, a guy who the state uses as their go-to. It's very difficult for them to turn around and say, no, doc, you don't know what you're talking about, because their top tier, heaviest hitters in that office go to Richardson for 100%.
And the judges, don't forget the judges, they know him. So if a state attorney tries to say that he doesn't know what he's talking about, the judge already is thinking, what the hell?
Judge will shut him down. So the third one under mitigating circumstances is subsection G, and that is the defendant acted under extreme duress or the domination of another person. That's much rarer, but it is occasionally workable where you have somebody who's like, a submissive personality that's being controlled by somebody else. But again, I don't want to spend too much time. Let's just take the last 2 or 3 minutes here and talk a little bit about Florida lawyers' assistance. And the only reason I'm bringing it up is two reasons. One, to highlight the fact that lawyers are people too. Like everybody else, we suffer from the same frailties as anyone else in any other walk of life. We could be very good at our day job, but complete F-ups in our personal lives. And so Florida Lawyers Assistance was created in 1986. It was originally established only for alcohol abuse. It wasn't until 1998 that it got expanded to include controlled substances and mental health issues. Interestingly, part of the reason that it did not originally include drug issues was because it was believed that if it was illegal drugs that the lawyer was using, it was a criminal problem, and that shouldn't be treated by mental health. Florida Lawyers Assistance has evolved. Our particular program here in the state of Florida is the biggest one in the country. We are the most comprehensive in the entire United States. So we really have come a long way, and the court system as well, in terms of developing mental health courts, veterans courts, teen courts, unified family courts. The eyes are being opened to the reality of the effects of mental health and how they impact people in the system and the system itself. So if you are a lawyer with a problem, You can go to Florida Lawyers Assistance on your own. It is confidential. They're not going to leak anything, and they will help you to avoid a problem.
They will advocate. They'll advocate for you.
Right.
If you put yourself in their hands. Yes.
If you are a lawyer who winds up in trouble with the Florida bar, let's say you get arrested and you have to report to the bar, or let's say somebody files a grievance against you and the bar is dealing with that, they may refer you to Florida Lawyers Assistance. So it could either be voluntary or it could be referred. But I wanted to give the doc an opportunity to talk about professionals in general, but lawyers in particular, and we're right up against it. So as swiftly
Yeah,
as
I think we should do. I think we
just to
should
talk
do a
about
future
those
show.
those
I think we should do a
extraordinary
future
issues.
show with looking at impaired professionals in general and how they can be helped to I know in my profession and in the medical profession, you can have your license revoked. You can't practice. They'll pull you out of practice if you're known to have a problem, and you're not going to get that license back to practice or that bar card back to practice.
Or if you're a pilot, or if you're any kind of licensed individual, a cosmetologist, it doesn't matter. If you own the license. It's a huge problem, and that's why these programs exist, to help impaired professionals of whatever stripe get better and get back, to practicing their particular specialties. FLA is, very, very well respected, as is PRN in Florida, which is the equivalent for docs. Is that physician's referral?
It stands for Professional Resource Network, but it's for anybody licensed under
DOH.
Yeah, right. Anybody.
Great.
So pharmacists, dentists, psychologists, physicians.
So without putting you on the spot, I mean, are lawyers particularly troublesome patients, or are we just par with everybody else?
No more so than any other professionals who
Good
think
to know.
that this shouldn't be such a problem.
Before we sign off on Mike,
and give me my license back. Right.
I have one last question, and then I'll give it to Martinez for the final word. I just want to know one last question of you, Doc, if you don't mind.
Sure.
How am I?
How are you?
How am I?
Better, since you've given him the new med. I don't know what you got him on.
We're going to let Ed talk about that.
Martinez, take it home.
I want to end with this on a serious note, on a very serious note. To anybody who's listening or anybody who knows anyone with mental health illnesses, more people are understanding this, Doc. I'm sure you'll agree with me.
Yep.
We really need to understand that mental health illness is no different than having diabetes. Okay? If you have a mental health illness, you have an illness. If you have diabetes, you don't sit there trying to heal it yourself. Some people do, but they always fail. Mental health is no different. It's just an illness. It doesn't make you weak, doesn't make you bad, doesn't make you anything other than like you got diabetes. You need to go see the specialist so that they can get you on a program to get you healthy, right? You go see your diabetic doctor. He says, hey, you got to cut out these foods, eat healthier, get some exercise. That's why you have Dr. Bergman. When you have a mental health illness,
I couldn't agree with you more.
It's just an illness, guys. Don't get caught up in all the bullshit and all the other negative.
And it's treated. They're treatable.
Very treatable.
They're fixable.
Very treatable. Most of them are, especially if you get them soon, early on.
It's good to know there's hope for me.
No, there is.
There's hope for all of us.
Look, I'm okay.
Oh, yeah. You're the picture of health. All right, guys. I want to thank everybody for being here and for the audience for tuning in. Dr. Bergman, thank you so much for taking time out of your day. Hopefully nobody went into crisis as a result of your being here with us.
I hope not.
And we will talk about doing a future show to follow up on particular circumstances relative to professional treatment.
Right.
With that, I want to thank everybody for watching episode number 45. And we look forward to seeing you next week for episode number 46, where Ed and I will be back at your service.